There is a building that still stands about 40 miles from where I live. It sits empty now, behind rusted gates and overgrown pathways. The locals call it the Old Asylum. Most people drive past without a second thought, but if you stop, if you walk close enough to see through the barred windows into those long corridors, something about the place feels wrong. Not haunted in the supernatural sense, wrong in a deeper way, as if the architecture itself remembers something we have chosen to forget. The question that haunts these buildings is simple, but difficult to answer. What happened to the people who entered but never left? Not in the philosophical sense, but in the practical, documentary sense. Where are their records? What became of them? Why do the admission ledgers show thousands entering, but so few departing? Between 1850 and 1900, the asylum population in the United States grew from approximately 4,000 to over 74,000. In Britain, the numbers were even more staggering. By 1890, England and Wales housed nearly 86,000 asylum patients in over 100 institutions. These were not temporary stays. The average length of confinement stretched into years, often decades. Many patients admitted in their 20s died in their 70s, having spent their entire adult lives within asylum walls. The architectural evidence tells part of this story. When you examine these buildings, you are not looking at structures designed for healing and release. The features repeat across different countries, different architects, different decades. Thick stone walls, sometimes 3 feet deep, windows placed high and barred with iron, massive corridors wide enough for staff to move patients in groups, central observation domes allowing surveillance of multiple wings simultaneously, locked wards accessible only by keys held by attendants, isolation cells and basements, small and dark, designed to break resistance rather than promote recovery. This architecture required enormous investment. The Worcester State Hospital in Massachusetts, opened in 1833, cost nearly $500,000 to construct. The Kirkbride buildings that became the standard asylum design featured elaborate facades, expensive materials, advanced heating systems. These were not temporary facilities. They were permanent infrastructure built to house people for the remainder of their lives. But who were these people? The admission records provide troubling answers. Yes, individuals with serious mental illnesses were institutionalized, but they were outnumbered by vast categories of people whose reasons for confinement had little to do with mental health as we understand it. The ledgers list causes such as found wandering, no family, melancholy, domestic trouble, disappointment in love, religious enthusiasm, overwork, intemperance, moral insanity, and simply unknown. Women were admitted for hysteria, change of life, grief over death of family, refusal to perform wifely duties, men for political excitement, business troubles, masturbation, laziness, the elderly for senility regardless of whether they posed any danger, children for being orphaned with no relatives to claim them. One category appears with particular frequency, unable to explain origin. People discovered in towns or on roads who could not provide coherent accounts of where they came from. They had no identification, no family connections, no story that satisfied authorities. They were collected, processed, and institutionalized. Their admission forms often contain blank spaces where name, age, and birthplace should be recorded. They entered the asylum as nobody, and many died as nobody, assigned numbers rather than identities. Consider what this means. A person found wandering could be institutionalized indefinitely based solely on their inability to account for themselves. No crime committed, no violent behavior, simply the wrong answers to questions about identity and origin. Once admitted, proving you deserved release became nearly impossible. The very act of insisting you were sane could be taken as evidence of delusion. The numbers begin to reveal a pattern. In Massachusetts, the asylum population increased from roughly 1,000 in 1940 to over 7,000 by 1880. The state's general population doubled in that period. The asylum population increased 7-fold. Similar ratios appear across industrializing nations. Something about the mid to late 19th century created conditions requiring massive institutionalization of people who did not fit social structures. Industrialization disrupted traditional communities. Rural populations moved to cities where they had no family networks. Economic depressions destroyed livelihoods and left people destitute. Cholera and typhoid epidemics killed parents and created orphans. Immigration brought millions to unfamiliar countries where language barriers and cultural differences made navigation difficult. All of this is documented and uncontroversial, but does it fully explain the scale? Before 1800, societies managed similar problems without building institutions on this magnitude. Poorhouses existed. Families absorbed members who could not care for themselves. Communities found ways to manage people who did not fit conventional categories. The sudden emergence of the asylum system suggests that something about the period between 1850 and 1900 created new problems, or problems of unprecedented scale. The admission records hint at what those problems might have been. Large numbers of people with trauma, with memory loss, with inability to explain their circumstances. People separated from families and communities. People whose skills had become obsolete. People struggling to adapt to rapidly changing conditions. The asylums absorbed them all under the broad umbrella of mental illness, but the category suggests social displacement more than medical diagnosis. Once admitted, leaving proved extraordinarily difficult. A study of British asylums in the 1960s found that fewer than 30% of patients were ever discharged. The remainder died in the institutions. American statistics were similar. The Willard Asylum in New York, opened in 1869 specifically for chronic cases, was designed for 1,500 patients. By 1880, it held over 2,000. Admissions far exceeded deaths and releases combined. What does it mean that 70% of people admitted to asylums never left? It means the system was not designed for cure and release. The architecture confirms this. The buildings were built for permanence. The wards were designed for long-term habitation. The farms and workshops attached to asylums expected patient labor indefinitely. This was warehousing, not treatment. The documentation itself presents disturbing patterns. Admission ledgers are often meticulous for the first years of an asylum's operation. Names, ages, circumstances of admission, diagnoses, all carefully recorded. Then the records become spotty. Whole years have missing pages. Patient files that should exist according to administrative logs cannot be located. Deaths are recorded without names, only numbers. Discharges note that a patient left, but provide no destination, no indication who claimed them or where they went. Fire destroyed some asylum archives. Administrative chaos and staff turnover lost others. The sheer volume of patients overwhelmed record-keeping systems. These explanations are plausible, but the pattern is consistent enough across different institutions in different regions to invite questions about whether the gaps are entirely accidental. What happens when someone enters an institution and the record of their release simply does not exist? They vanish from history. No death certificate in external records, no discharge papers, no indication they ever left. They entered the asylum and ceased to exist in the documentary record. The burial grounds tell part of this story. Most large asylums maintained cemeteries on their grounds. The graves are marked simply, if at all. Small stones or metal markers numbered sequentially, occasionally a name, but more often just a number corresponding to a ledger that may or may not survive. Some asylum cemeteries contain thousands of graves.
Excavations of these sites have revealed troubling evidence. Mass graves containing multiple bodies. Graves of children far too numerous for a facility supposedly treating adult mental illness. Skeletal remains showing signs of malnutrition and untreated disease. The physical evidence confirms what the fragmentary records suggest. These were sites of mass death on a scale contemporaries largely ignored and subsequent generations have preferred to forget. The mortality rates were appalling. Tuberculosis spread through overcrowded wards. Patients died from pneumonia, dysentery, typhoid. Some died from the treatments themselves. Cold water therapy that induced shock, restraints that caused circulation problems and bed sores, forced feeding that led to aspiration pneumonia, isolation that drove already fragile minds to complete breakdown. Death registers that survive show spikes in certain years. At the Worcester Asylum, 1854 saw over 150 deaths out of a patient population of roughly 450. That is a mortality rate exceeding 30% in a single year. Similar spikes appear in records from other institutions. Something would happen, an epidemic, a particularly harsh winter, a change in treatment protocols, and deaths would multiply. But what happened to the bodies? Most were buried in asylum cemeteries with minimal ceremony. Families often could not afford to claim remains and transport them elsewhere. Many patients had no families at all, or families who had severed contact. They were buried in numbered graves, their names recorded in ledgers that have since been lost or destroyed. Some bodies were used for medical education. Asylum doctors needed cadavers for anatomical study. Unclaimed bodies provided a convenient supply. This practice was legal and documented. What is less clear is how many bodies were disposed of this way and whether families were informed when it happened. The question of what happened to those who never left becomes more complicated when you consider that leaving did not necessarily mean freedom. Some patients were transferred between institutions. A person admitted to one asylum might be moved to another when the first became overcrowded. The transfer would be noted in one set of records but might not appear in another. Follow the paper trail, and the person simply disappears between institutions. Other patients were released but with nowhere to go. Deinstitutionalization in the early 20th century emptied some asylums. Patients who had been confined for decades were suddenly discharged. Many had no families remaining. They had no job skills applicable to the world outside. Some had been institutionalized since childhood and had no memory of independent living. What happened to them after release is largely undocumented. The few follow-up studies that exist paint a grim picture. High rates of homelessness among discharged patients, high rates of reinstitutionalization. Some simply wandered away and were never heard from again. They entered the asylum from obscurity and returned to obscurity when discharged. The system that was supposed to care for them simply let them go when maintaining them became too expensive or politically untenable. Children who grew up in asylums faced particular challenges. Some institutions housed large numbers of young people, admitted as orphans or as children with developmental disabilities. They received minimal education. They were trained for simple labor. When they reached adulthood, many remained institutionalized because they had nowhere else to go and no capacity for independent survival. A study of one asylum in the 1920s found that roughly 40% of adult patients had been admitted before age 18. They had spent their entire conscious lives in the institution. Release for these individuals was not liberation, but exile into a world they did not understand and could not navigate. Women faced their own particular difficulties. Female patients outnumbered males in many asylums. Some were there for legitimate mental health reasons. Others were institutionalized by husbands or fathers for reasons that had more to do with social control than medicine. Refusing to be submissive, expressing interest in education or politics, surviving assault, and being unable to maintain the pretense that nothing had happened. Once institutionalized, women spent the rest of their lives confined. Discharge typically required a male relative to claim them. Women without family, or whose families refused to take them back, had no path to release. They grew old in the asylum, their lives consumed by an institution that claimed to be caring for them. The elderly institutionalized for senility rarely left. In an era before Social Security or old age pensions, aging people without family support had few options. A diagnosis of senility, even if the person was simply old and forgetful rather than dangerously confused, could result in permanent institutionalization. They died in the asylum, often within a few years of admission, and were buried in the asylum cemetery, their names recorded in ledgers that have since been lost or destroyed. Immigrants faced particular vulnerability.
Language barriers made communication difficult. Cultural differences in behavior could be misinterpreted as mental disturbance. Immigrants who arrived alone, whose families had been separated during passage, or who had no established community, could be institutionalized if they encountered any difficulty. The records from port cities show immigrants institutionalized within weeks of arrival. Some were genuinely suffering from mental illness. Others seem to have been confined simply because they were foreign, alone, and struggling to adapt. They entered the asylum and often spent the remainder of their lives there, cut off from the communities they had hoped to join. Veterans of the Civil War and other conflicts filled asylum wards. Men returned from battle profoundly changed by what they had experienced. With no understanding of psychological trauma, these men were diagnosed with various forms of insanity and institutionalized when their families could no longer manage them. They spent decades in asylums, their war service forgotten, their suffering unacknowledged. The question of what happened to those who never left is ultimately a question about erasure. These were people who entered institutions and ceased to exist as individuals. They became numbers in ledgers, bodies in cemeteries, statistics and reports. Their stories, when they can be reconstructed at all, speak of lives interrupted and never resumed. Some historians estimate that over 1 million people were institutionalized in American asylums between 1850 and 1900. If 70% never left through discharge, that is 700,000 people who died in these institutions. Their graves, when they can be located, are mostly unmarked or marked only with numbers. Their names appear in fragmentary records, if at all. They vanished into the asylum system and never emerged. This is not speculation, it is documented fact. The buildings still stand, the cemeteries can still be located. The records, as incomplete as they are, exist in archives. Anyone willing to examine the evidence will find the same pattern repeating across different institutions, different states, different countries. What happened to those who entered but never left? Most died in the institutions. They were buried in asylum cemeteries, their records were lost or destroyed, their families forgot them or never knew what became of them. They were erased from history, leaving only fragments in archives and bones in unmarked graves. The asylums themselves began to close in the late 20th century. Deinstitutionalization movements and changing treatment approaches emptied the massive Victorian institutions. Some buildings were converted to other uses, many were simply abandoned. They sit empty now, too expensive to demolish, too contaminated to repurpose safely. These abandoned asylums have become sites of dark tourism. People explore them, photograph the decay, feel the thrill of trespassing in forbidden spaces. But beneath the aesthetic appeal of ruins lies something more disturbing. These buildings are monuments to mass erasure. Thousands of people entered them and never left. Their lives were consumed by an institution that claimed to care for them, but primarily warehoused them until they died. When you stand in those corridors, when you see the isolation cells and the restraint equipment and the numbered graves, you are standing in spaces where people vanished, not metaphorically, literally vanished from the historical record, from social memory, from any accounting that acknowledges them as individuals with stories worth preserving. The question of what happened to them has no complete answer. The records are too fragmentary, too many ledgers have been lost, too many graves are unmarked, but the pattern is clear enough. They entered institutions that were designed for permanence, not treatment. They lived in conditions that prioritized control over care. They died at rates far higher than the general population. They were buried with minimal ceremony, and they were forgotten. This is the reality behind the grand architecture and the reformist rhetoric. The asylums of the 19th century were not primarily therapeutic institutions. They were systems for removing people who didn't fit, who could not account for themselves, who had nowhere else to go. Once removed, those people rarely returned. They spent years or decades or entire lifetimes confined, and when they died, they were buried in numbered graves that few people visit and fewer remember. What happened to those who entered but never left? They were erased, systematically, institutionally, completely erased. The buildings remember even if we have forgotten. The graves remain even if they are unmarked. The fragments of records survive even if they are incomplete. The question is whether we are willing to look at the evidence and acknowledge what it reveals about how societies manage people they wish would disappear.